She didn't walk into his world. She was sold into it. 26 years old, brilliant with numbers, invisible to everyone who should have loved her. And her own father traded her like a debt marker to the most feared man in Chicago. No warning, no apology, just a phone call, a car at the curb, and a door closing behind her that she didn't know would never open the same way again. They told her Arthur Moretti was a monster. They were wrong about what kind. If you're watching this story right now, stay until the end, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin, Maud. The rain came in sideways that Thursday evening, the kind that didn't fall so much as a tack, driving against the glass towers of downtown Chicago like it had a grudge. Nora Jenkins stood in the lobby of her apartment building with a single rolling suitcase and a paper bag of toiletries she'd packed in under 20 minutes. And she watched the black SUV idle at the curb with its lights cutting white slashes through the dark. She hadn't cried. She told herself that was because she was past crying. The truth was closer to this. She was too numb to locate the grief. It was in there somewhere, packed tight behind her sternum, like a stone she couldn't cough up. But the mechanics of feeling it, the actual business of grief, had simply stopped functioning somewhere between her father's phone call and the moment she zipped her suitcase. William Jenkins had called her at 4:47 in the afternoon. She remembered the time because she'd been staring at a forensic audit spreadsheet, buried 40 columns deep into a client's shadow ledger, and she'd almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Nora. His voice had been clipped, efficient, the same voice he used when he called her firm to complain about the quality of her work during her first year, before she'd built enough of a reputation that he couldn't reach her without going through reception. There's been a development. I need you to listen without interrupting. She'd listened. That was always what she did. Listened, absorbed, processed. It was what made her exceptional at forensic accounting. She could hear numbers the way some people heard music, in patterns and rhythms and off notes that signaled something wrong beneath the surface. But she'd never applied that skill to her father's voice, never listened for the frequency of a man who was about to sell his daughter to keep himself breathing. I owe a debt, he'd said. $3 million. The man it's owed to has agreed to forgive it entirely in exchange for an arrangement. She'd waited. The spreadsheet blurred. He wants to meet you, and if the meeting goes as he expects, there'll be a contract, a marriage contract. Nora had set down her coffee mug very carefully. You're joking. I don't joke about survival. Whose survival? He hadn't answered that. She hadn't needed him to. The SUV was still idling. A man in a dark overcoat stood beside the rear door, umbrella raised, waiting with the particular stillness of someone who had learned patience as a professional skill. Not aggressive, not threatening, just certain, the way mountains were certain. Nora picked up her suitcase, walked through the lobby doors, and let the rain hit her face. She didn't run. Running would have meant she believed there was somewhere to go. The man with the umbrella inclined his head slightly. Ms. Jenkins. His voice was deep, neutral, from somewhere in the South originally. She caught the ghost of it in the vowels. Mr. Moretti sends his regards. Are you ready? Does it matter? The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. No, ma'am, I suppose it doesn't. She got in the car. The drive north took 40 minutes through traffic that crawled and stuttered in the rain. Nora kept her bag on her lap and watched the city slide past the tinted windows. The lit storefronts, the wet sidewalks, the ordinary Thursday night lives of people who hadn't been traded by their fathers. She cataloged everything the way she always cataloged things she couldn't control, methodically, without sentiment, building a picture she could use later. The driver's name, she learned from the ID badge clipped to the visor, was Dario Cassin. He didn't speak after the initial greeting, which she appreciated. The two men flanking her in the rear seat, large, quiet, radiating the specific stillness of trained violence, never introduced themselves at all. She used the 40 minutes to think. Arthur Moretti. She knew the name the way everyone in Chicago knew the name, the same way you knew the lake was cold and the winters were punishing, and certain neighborhoods had certain rules that didn't require posting. The Moretti family had operated in this city for 40 years. Shipping, real estate, construction, And beneath all of it, the infrastructure of organized crime running like a secondary circulatory system through the city's legitimate economy. Arthur had taken control of the organization at 34 after his father's stroke. He was 41 now. In those 7 years, he had expanded every legitimate business, reduced visible criminal activity to the point where prosecutors couldn't touch him, and built a reputation for being, depending on who you asked, either a visionary businessman or the most dangerous man in Illinois. He had never been married. That detail felt significant, though she couldn't yet articulate why. What she knew about herself was this. She was 26, she held a master's degree in forensic accounting from Northwestern. She worked for a mid-tier financial investigations firm where her talent was quietly legendary and her profile was deliberately minimal, and she had a gift for finding the money people believed they'd hidden. She could read a financial record the way other people read faces. Not just what it said, but what it was working not to say. She also knew she was 5'4", wore her hair in a practical braid more days than not, owned exactly one dress that qualified as formal, and had spent the majority of her professional life being physically overlooked in rooms that underestimated her, right up until the moment they didn't. She had no idea what a man like Arthur Moretti wanted with a woman like her. The SUV turned through iron gates that swung open without anyone touching them. Sensors, she noted, expensive ones, and wound up a long private drive through grounds she couldn't fully see in the dark. What she could see was enough. The drive was immaculate despite the rain, the landscaping precise even in March, and the house that materialized from the dark was enormous without being ostentatious. Old Chicago money understood that real power didn't need to announce itself. The house said, "We have been here for a long time and we intend to remain." The front door opened before the car stopped. He was taller than she'd expected. That was her first thought, and she was annoyed at herself for having it. As if height were relevant, as if she'd been cataloging physical details instead of tactical ones. But he stood in the open doorway with the light behind him and the rain driving past, and the sheer physical certainty of him was the first thing that landed before she could filter it. Arthur Moretti was not handsome in any conventional or comfortable way. His face was hard-edged and had clearly been rearranged at least once by force. The nose set at a slight angle that surgery could have fixed, but hadn't. Dark hair, silver at the temples. Eyes that were, she realized as she got closer, not dark as she'd assumed from photographs, but a deep and unsettling gray, the color of lake water before a storm. He wore a dark suit with no tie, the collar open, which meant he hadn't dressed for this meeting or had deliberately underdressed for it. Neither interpretation was comforting. He didn't move from the doorway as she walked up the front steps. He let the rain hit her for 3 seconds longer than was necessary, then stepped aside. "Miss Jenkins." His voice was lower than the driver's and quieter. "Thank you for coming." "You're welcome," she said, because she'd decided in the car that the one thing she could control was how she spoke, and she was going to speak like someone who hadn't been frightened. "Though I'd like to discuss the difference between an invitation and a summons at some point." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a recalibration. "Of course," he said. He gestured toward the interior. "Please." She walked in. The room he brought her to wasn't a study or a formal sitting room. It was a working space, a long table covered in documents, 2 laptops open, whiteboards along one wall covered in diagrams she clocked immediately as financial flowcharts. She stopped just inside the doorway. "You work in here?" she said. "Every night." She turned and looked at him directly. "Then this isn't a social meeting." It was never going to be. He moved past her to the head of the table and pulled out 2 chairs, one at the head, one at the corner, and waited for her to choose. The positioning was deliberate. He was giving her the option to sit as an equal or to sit as a subordinate, and he was watching to see which she'd pick. She took the corner chair. He sat at the head. A woman appeared from somewhere behind them, mid-50s, efficient, carrying a tray with water and coffee, and disappeared again without speaking. "Your father told you it was about the debt," Arthur said. He wasn't phrasing it as a question. $3 million, yes. You're waiving it in exchange for... what he described as a marriage arrangement. That's what he was told. She looked at him. And what's the truth? He picked up the coffee, drank, set it down, looked at her the way she sometimes looked at a spreadsheet when she knew the number she was searching for was buried somewhere in the columns. Your father didn't lose $3 million gambling. He stole $14 million from my construction holding company over a period of 3 years through a network of shell entities and false vendor accounts. The room went very quiet. Outside, the rain found a gap somewhere in the old house's architecture and produced a sound like distant tapping. Nora didn't move. 14 million? 14.3 with accrued interest. And you know this because my own financial team identified the anomaly 18 months ago. What they haven't been able to do is trace the full network. The architecture is sophisticated, he paused. Unusually sophisticated for a man like William Jenkins, which suggested he had help. You're telling me my father isn't smart enough to have done this alone. I'm telling you that whoever helped him built something I haven't been able to fully map. And I have very good people. Nora looked at the whiteboards. The flowcharts were thorough. They were good work, actually, the work of someone who genuinely understood financial forensics. But they stopped in several places where the trail went cold, the lines trailing off into question marks and partial entity names. She could see, even from across the room, where the structure changed in character, where the architecture shifted from one design philosophy to another, the seam visible if you knew what to look for. You married me, she said slowly, because you need someone who can read this. I contracted a marriage, he said, because it was the only arrangement your father would accept without running. He believed he was protecting himself by tying his family to mine. He thought it made him harder to touch. His voice was completely flat. He doesn't understand that it did the opposite. And me? She kept her voice even. What did you believe about me? I read your work, Arthur said. The Hargrove case, the Pinnacle Capital dissolution, the fraudulent trust structures you uncovered for the Bellamy estate. You found things that 3 different forensic teams missed. Those are sealed cases. Yes. He didn't elaborate on how he'd accessed them. Nora breathed. In through the nose, steady, the way she breathed when she was staring at a ledger at 2 a.m. and needed to quiet the noise in her head and find the signal. She did it now because the alternative was letting the enormity of what he'd just laid out, the calculated nature of every step that had brought her to this room, crack something in her chest that she couldn't afford to have cracked tonight. So my father sold me, she said, and you bought me. And the reason you bought me is that you need me to find your stolen money. 14.3 million, Arthur said, and the person who built the network to steal it. What happens if I say no? He considered the question. It clearly wasn't the first time he'd considered it. Your father's debt remains. I pursue it through other means. You go home. And my father? A pause. That's a separate conversation. She understood what that meant. She was meant to understand what it meant. Nora looked at the whiteboards again. She looked at the partial entity names, the broken trails, the places where the architecture changed. Her mind was already moving, already identifying the anomalies in the anomalies, already forming hypotheses about what kind of person had designed the sections her father couldn't have managed alone. It was an involuntary response, the same way a musician couldn't stop hearing the off note in an otherwise clean piece. The structure was broken in ways that told her things. It was already talking to her. She hated that her mind worked this way. She hated that sitting in this room, facing this man, the largest part of her was already thinking about the problem. If I do this, she said, what does the marriage actually mean? It means you're protected, he said. My name is the safest name in this city. It means you have access to everything in this house, staff, resources, whatever you need to work. It means we present a united front to anyone who might be watching. He paused. It does not mean anything you haven't explicitly agreed to. I want that clear. She looked at him, looked for the angle, the tell, the place where the performance cracked and showed what was underneath. She was good at this, reading people the way she read numbers, finding the thing they were working not to say. She couldn't find it, which was either evidence that he was genuine or evidence that he was very, very good. I want a written agreement, she said. Specific terms. Access to every financial record your team has already compiled, not summaries, raw data. And I work independently. I'll share findings, but I control the methodology. Something in Arthur's expression shifted again, less like recalibration this time, more like relief, almost. The expression of a man who'd been waiting to see if the thing he'd gambled on was real. Agreed, he said. I also want the truth about my father, all of it, not what you decide I need to know. The relief, if that's what it was, didn't entirely disappear, but it got more complicated. That may be harder than the financial work. I didn't ask if it was hard. He looked at her for a long moment. All of it, he said finally. Yes, and said. They were married 4 days later in a civil ceremony in the library of the Moretti estate, witnessed by Dario Cassin and a woman named Elena, who managed the household with the quiet precision of a military operation. The judge was a tired-looking man in his 60s who read the words with the energy of someone reciting a grocery list and left immediately after without making eye contact with anyone. Nora wore dark slacks and a white blouse. She had not bought anything new. Arthur wore a suit, no tie. His hands during the brief ring exchange were steady and certain. Hers were not, and she was furious at herself for the way her fingers trembled slightly as the ring settled onto her knuckle. A simple band, platinum, no ornamentation. He'd asked her 2 days before what kind of ring she wanted. She'd said she didn't care. He'd gotten the plainest ring available, which was either considerate or indifferent, and she hadn't decided which. After the judge left, Elena brought champagne that no one touched, and Dario shook Arthur's hand without expression and gave Nora a nod that she interpreted as something close to respectful, and then everyone dispersed and she was standing alone in the library of a house that now, technically, contained her life. She went to her room, the suite Elena had prepared, separate from Arthur's wing, private, and sat on the edge of the bed for 11 minutes, not crying, just breathing. Then she went back to the workroom, opened her laptop, pulled up the raw financial data Arthur's team had uploaded to the secure server, and started reading. By midnight, she had found the first thread they'd missed. By 2 in the morning, she had pulled that thread far enough to see the shape of something underneath the theft of $14 million that was so much larger and so much darker that she sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Arthur found her there at 2:30, appearing in the doorway in a gray sweater, carrying 2 mugs. He looked at her expression and set a mug in front of her without speaking. Tea. Not coffee. She didn't know how he'd known. "What did you find?" he asked. She looked at him. "Your money wasn't stolen by my father. Your father's money was stolen through my father. There's a difference." He sat down across from her slowly. "Say that again." "William Jenkins is a courier," she said. "Possibly a willing one, possibly not. I don't have enough yet to determine the degree of his agency, but the architecture of this network wasn't designed to take your money and hide it. It was designed to move your money somewhere specific." She turned the laptop toward him. "And I think I know who built the destination." Arthur looked at the screen. His expression changed in a way she couldn't fully read. Not fear, not anger, something older and more complicated than either. "That account," he said quietly, "routes through a holding structure I've seen before, a year ago, in connection with a man who nearly destroyed my shipping contracts through city regulatory channels." "Who?" Nora asked. Arthur looked up from the screen and met her eyes. "Congressman Philip Hastings," he said. The rain had stopped sometime in the last hour without her noticing. The house was perfectly quiet. Nora could hear her own pulse. She looked at Arthur across the table covered in numbers and broken trails. In this house, where she'd arrived as a debt, and somewhere in the last 8 hours had become something else entirely. And she understood with the clarity she felt only when a ledger finally revealed its true structure. That the danger they were sitting inside was not the 14 million, and was not her father, and was not even the marriage that had upended her entire life. The danger was the man on the other side of that money, the man with the power and the reach and the political cover to erase both of them. And Nora Jenkins, Moretti now, on paper, had just pulled the thread that would unravel him. She just didn't know yet whether unraveling it would bury them both first. The name hung in the air between them, like smoke that wouldn't clear. Philip Hastings. 2 words that meant something in this city, the way weather meant something. Not abstract, not distant, but the kind of thing that determined whether you could move freely or whether you stayed inside and waited. Senator-grade ambitions packed into a congressional seat, charity galas with his name on the invitations, newspaper profiles that used words like reformer and architect of change, a face that had been on billboards during 3 consecutive campaigns, always photographed from the left side, always with the same studied expression of confident concern. Nora had voted for him once. She realized that sitting in the workroom at 2:30 in the morning, looking at the financial architecture that bore his fingerprints, and the realization landed in her stomach like something gone cold. Arthur hadn't moved since saying the name. He was looking at the laptop screen with an expression she was beginning to learn. Not anger on the surface, but something underneath the surface that was much more controlled and therefore much more dangerous than anger. His jaw was set. His right hand rested flat on the table, fingers spread, and she could see the tendons working slightly. "How certain are you?" he asked. "On the routing structure?" "Very." She pulled the laptop back, turned it to face her, started typing. The holding company that receives the terminal transfers, Lakeward Strategic Partners, LLC, was incorporated in Delaware 14 months ago. Registered agent is a law firm that handles political PAC structures. I can't prove the Hastings connection from this alone, but the timing correlates with his push to open the new port regulatory review. The review that cost me 3 contracts. $2.8 million in lost contracts based on what I've read in your files. She didn't look up from the screen. If you needed startup capital to fund a hostile move against your shipping interests and your own money got rerouted to finance it, he used my money to destroy my business. That's what the data suggests. She finally looked up. But I need more. I need the actual transaction records inside Lakeward. I need the beneficial ownership documentation. And I need to understand what my father knew and when he knew it, because the shell structure on his end was built by someone who understood exactly how his financial habits would obscure the trail. Arthur stood. He moved to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and added Lakeward Strategic Partners to the map with a line connecting it to the question marks his own team had left. He wrote the name in the same block letters as everything else. Precise, controlled. Then he set the marker down and stood looking at the board with his back to her. "My team looked at Hastings 8 months ago," he said. "They didn't find a connection. Because they were looking for a direct connection. There isn't one. There are 4 layers of corporate structure between him and the money, and each layer was designed to look like a legitimate investment vehicle." She paused. Whoever advised him knew what they were doing. "That's what worries me more than Hastings." She waited. He turned. "Hastings is a politician. He's ambitious and he's corrupt, but he's also a man who needs other people to execute anything genuinely complex. Someone is advising him, someone who understands financial forensics well enough to build a structure that defeated my team." He looked at her steadily. "Someone who knew what your father's financial behavior looked like from the inside." The implication settled. Nora felt it settle. Not with shock exactly, but with the particular physical sensation of a thing she'd been not quite thinking suddenly becoming unavoidable. Her father hadn't been recruited randomly. He'd been recruited because someone understood him, because someone had studied him or known him well enough to predict exactly how he'd behave and exactly how his behavior would read to anyone looking from the outside. "You think there's someone inside your organization?" she said. "I think it's possible." "Do you know who?" "If I knew, we wouldn't be having this conversation at 2:30 in the morning." His voice was even, but the flatness of it carried weight. "I have people I trust and people I need. Those aren't always the same list." Nora closed the laptop. She was tired. The concentrated kind of tired that came from running on the wrong side of midnight, the kind where your eyes felt gritty and your thoughts started losing their edges. But underneath the tiredness was something that wasn't tiredness at all. The particular electrical charge of a problem that was real and large and solvable, if you were precise enough and patient enough and willing to follow the thread wherever it went. "I'm going to need 3 things tomorrow," she said. "Full access to your personnel files for anyone who had financial oversight access in the last 4 years. Every piece of communications records your legal team can get me without triggering discovery obligations. And a direct conversation with my father." Arthur's expression didn't change. "The last one may be difficult." I didn't ask if it was difficult. He almost smiled. Not warmly, more the way a man smiles when someone does exactly what he expected, and it still surprises him slightly. I'll arrange it. She stood, picked up the mug. The tea had gone cold, but she drank the last of it anyway, and moved toward the door. She stopped in the doorway without turning around. You said my name is the safest name in this city, she said. How safe is it from Hastings? A pause that lasted just long enough to mean something. Safer than it was yesterday, Arthur said. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. Beitat. Morning came in gray and grudging, the kind of March morning that couldn't decide whether to rain again or just threaten it. Nora was in the workroom by 7 with coffee that Elena had left outside her door in a thermos. Not knocked, not announced, just appeared. And she had the personnel files open on her laptop and a yellow legal pad in front of her by the time Arthur appeared at 7:40. He was already dressed, suit, no tie again. He moved through the room like someone who had already been awake for hours, which she suspected was true. 3 names came up in the preliminary cross-reference, she said without looking up. People with both financial access and irregular communication patterns in the 18 months prior to the first anomalous transfer. He poured coffee from the thermos. No hesitation, no asking, and sat across from her. Tell me. Your CFO's assistant, a man named Cole Pratt, took 4 personal trips to Washington, D.C. in that window. Expensed as client development, I don't see any client in the D.C. metro area that would justify 4 visits. Cole's been with the organization for 6 years. That's not evidence of loyalty. That's evidence of patience. She moved her finger down the legal pad. Second name is Marcus Venn, your third-party logistics coordinator. He opened a personal investment account 8 months ago with an initial deposit of $60,000. His salary doesn't support that. Arthur's expression didn't shift. And the third? She hesitated. The hesitation was visible and she couldn't prevent it. Lena Farrow, she said. Your legal counsel. Silence. She's been with me for 11 years, Arthur said. His voice had changed quality. Not louder, not harder, but it had acquired a density. I know. And I could be wrong about her. The indicators are softer. A pattern of communication delays on specific file requests, 2 instances of case documentation being accessed outside normal working hours, a discrepancy in the billing records for the entity review that should have flagged the Lakeward structure. Nora looked up. It may be nothing, but I need to rule it out. You're asking me to suspect someone I trust. I'm asking you to let the data speak before you decide what to trust. She held his gaze. That's what you hired me for. You don't have to like it. He looked at her for a long moment. The gray eyes were unreadable in the particular way of a man who had survived long enough in a dangerous world to make unreadable into an art form. Then he stood, moved to the window, and looked out at the grounds where the morning light was finding its way through cloud cover and doing pale things to the grass. Check all 3, he said. But Nora, he turned. Be careful how you move inside this house. If you're right about any of them and they know you're looking, I know what I'm doing. I'm sure you believe that. Not unkind, just precise. What you know how to do is find money trails. What I'm talking about is something different. She thought about telling him she'd spent 3 years working cases that put people in prison, that she'd had files stolen from her office, and a client threaten her in a parking garage, and a senior partner try to bury her findings to protect his golf buddy. She thought about telling him that she understood exactly what it meant to pursue a truth someone powerful wanted left alone. She decided against it. She picked up her coffee instead. I'll be careful, she said. It wasn't the reassurance he was looking for, and they both knew it. The meeting with her father was arranged for 4 in the afternoon, 2 days later, in a room on the ground floor of the Moretti estate that was not the warm library or the working room, but a smaller space near the back of the house with 2 chairs and a table and no windows. The lack of windows was deliberate. Nora understood that when she walked in and found William Jenkins already seated, looking diminished in a way she had never seen him look. Her father, who was always groomed, always composed, always performing the version of himself he needed you to see. He looked up when she walked in. Something crossed his face that might have been shame if William Jenkins were a man who was capable of shame without an audience. Nora, he said, you look... Don't, she said. She sat down across from him. She set a folder on the table. She didn't open it yet. He was 58, her father. Still handsome in the way that well-maintained men of his generation were handsome. Full hair gone silver, expensive clothes, the kind of posture that came from decades of believing his physical presence was a form of currency. He'd always looked better than he was. She'd spent her childhood watching people respond to the package before they encountered the contents, and she'd learned very early that the gap between the two was where the real danger lived. "Are they treating you well?" he asked. "This place—" "Stop performing for me," she said. "There's no one watching." His jaw tightened. "I made a decision under considerable pressure. You sold me." Her voice was completely level. "Don't explain it. Don't contextualize it. Tell me about Lakeward's strategic partners." The name hit him. She watched it hit him. A micro-expression of shock before the composure reassembled. And that reaction alone told her more than she needed to know about how deeply he was in this. "I don't know what—" "William." She opened the folder, turned the first page to face him. "I'm not a jury. I'm not law enforcement. I'm the woman you sold to the man whose money you helped steal. And I'm very good at my job, and I've already traced the transfers through your company's vendor accounts into 3 shell entities that terminate at Lakeward." She paused. "I need to know how they got to you. Who approached you first?" He looked at the paper. She watched him calculate. The same calculation she'd watched him make her entire life, the swift private arithmetic of self-interest dressed up as deliberation. "I can't," he started. "You can." She leaned forward slightly. "You can because your alternative is Arthur Moretti deciding that your usefulness to this investigation has concluded." His eyes came up to hers. There was something in them now that was genuine. Not love, not remorse, but fear, pure and unadorned. "It was a lawyer," he said. "Called himself a financial consultant. Said he represented private investors who wanted to diversify through legitimate channels and needed someone with my kind of access." "His name?" "He used the name Garrett. I don't know if it was real." "What did he look like? How did he reach you?" "50s, tall. He had a meeting with me at the Clarendon Club, but I thought it was a normal business development conversation. He knew things about my business I hadn't told him, not public things." Her father's voice had dropped. "He knew about my debts. The real ones, not the ones I told people about. He knew about the money I'd borrowed from people I shouldn't have borrowed from, and he said he could make everything clean if I helped him route some transfers." "Did he tell you where the money was coming from?" A pause. "He said it was restructuring capital, held in various accounts by various interests." "He didn't tell you it was Arthur Moretti's money?" "No." "When did you figure it out?" Another pause. Longer. "About a year in." Nora looked at her father. She looked at him the way she looked at a document she'd finished reviewing, with the particular flatness of someone who has extracted everything useful and is now simply recording what they found. He had known for a year. He had spent a year knowing he was routing stolen money from the man who ran organized crime in Chicago, and his solution had been to keep doing it and hope the distance between himself and the crime remained navigable. And when the distance collapsed, he had handed his daughter over as a buffer. "Did Garrett ever mention Philip Hastings?" she asked. Her father's eyes changed. Just briefly. A flicker of something that was not surprise. "Dad?" "Hastings' name came up once," he said quietly. "Not from Garrett. From a different conversation. Someone else who reached out after things were already in motion. They wanted to know if I had any documentation of my arrangement with Garrett. Said they were doing due diligence on a political investment vehicle." "Who was it?" "A woman. She said she worked in regulatory affairs." Nora sat back. She looked at her father and felt, beneath the cold clarity of professional focus, something she didn't have a clean name for. Not grief, not anger, but the specific exhaustion of having your suspicions confirmed. The shape of the conspiracy was getting clearer, and its clarity was not making her feel better. It was making her feel the precise inverse of better. The chill that came with understanding that the thing you'd stumbled into was larger and more deliberate than you'd initially calculated. "Go back to the beginning," she said. "Everything. The first contact, the first transfer, every conversation with Garrett. I need it all." She spent the next 3 days barely sleeping. She built a secondary map on the whiteboard in the workroom, her own, separate from Arthur's team's version, and she worked outward from the confirmed nodes in concentric circles, cross-referencing transfer timing against public records, regulatory filing dates, and the political calendar of Philip Hastings' office. She ate at the table. She slept in the workroom chair twice and woke with her neck aching and her mind already running before she was fully conscious. Arthur checked on her. He did it carefully, appeared with food she hadn't asked for, with information she'd requested before she had to ask again, with the occasional blunt question that forced her to verbalize what she'd found and therefore see it more clearly. He didn't hover. He didn't ask questions that were really requests for reassurance. He treated her the way, she realized slowly, she'd always wanted to be treated by someone who held authority over her circumstances, as though her intelligence was a resource rather than an inconvenience. She filed that observation away without examining it. On the fourth morning, she found it. She'd been working through Cole Pratt's expense records, the 4 Washington, D.C. trips, cross-referencing hotel dates against Hastings' public schedule, which was partially available through congressional disclosure records. 3 of the 4 trips aligned within a 48-hour window of Hastings' fundraising events. The 4th had no obvious correlation until she checked the secondary calendar, the one filed by his office as staff scheduling rather than official congressional business. The 4th trip overlapped with a private dinner at a Georgetown private club. The club's events were not public, but the venue had filed a routine permit with the D.C. City Regulatory Office, and the permit listed the event organizer as Lakeward Strategic Partners, LLC. Cole Pratt had attended an event organized by Lakeward 14 months ago, before his own company's money had started moving into Lakeward's accounts, which meant Cole Pratt wasn't a compromised employee who'd been recruited after the scheme began. He'd been there at the design stage. She was reaching for her phone to call Arthur when she heard the door open behind her. She turned. It was not Arthur. Cole Pratt stood in the doorway of the workroom. He was 32, sandy-haired, with the kind of face that read as pleasant until you looked at it in a particular kind of light. He was carrying a coffee mug and wearing the expression of someone who'd wandered in casually, and he looked at her with the particular focused attention of a man who had already made a decision about the next 60 seconds and was simply waiting for the right moment. He looked at the whiteboard. She had not had time to cover it. His name was on it, circled, with a line connecting it to Lakeward. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. "You're better than they thought you'd be," Cole said. "Who's they?" she asked. Her voice came out steady. She was surprised by that. He looked at her across the room with his coffee mug and his pleasant face and his line on her whiteboard, and for a moment he almost looked apologetic. The way a man looks when he has to deliver bad news that isn't, technically, his fault. "You need to stop," he said quietly. "Whatever you found, wherever you think this goes, you need to close the files and tell Arthur you've hit a wall. You can do that. He'll believe you." His eyes moved to the whiteboard again. "Because the people on the other side of that line, they're not interested in fair, Ms. Jenkins. They don't do warnings. What you're looking at right now is the only warning you're going to get." Her heart was going very fast. She could feel it in her throat. "And if I don't?" she said. Cole Pratt looked at her with something that was not quite pity and not quite respect, and was something in between that had no comfortable name. "Then this stops being about money," he said. She didn't move. That was the first thing. The animal stillness that came not from calm but from the body's sudden inability to determine which direction safety was in. Cole Pratt stood in the doorway with his coffee mug and his careful voice and his threat dressed up as concern. And Nora stood 6 feet away from her whiteboard with her name and his name and Philip Hastings' name all connected by dry erase lines, and for approximately 3 seconds, her mind went completely white. Then it came back online. "You should leave this room," she said. Cole tilted his head slightly. "Ms. Jenkins, now." Her voice didn't shake. She was genuinely surprised that it didn't shake. "Because in about 90 seconds, Arthur is going to walk through that door for the morning briefing. And if you're still standing in here when he does, the conversation we're about to not have becomes a conversation he's going to have with you instead. And I don't think that's what anyone on your side of this wants right now." She watched him calculate. She could see it happening behind his pleasant face. The rapid private arithmetic of a man weighing his options against a timeline he hadn't fully accounted for. "You're smarter than they gave you credit for," he said. "Everyone always is." She held his gaze. "Leave." He left. The door closed behind him without a sound. Nora turned back to the whiteboard. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking now. The delayed physical response, the body catching up to what the mind had already processed and moved through. She pressed her palms flat against the table surface, felt the solid resistance of it, and breathed. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. The technique she'd used since graduate school when a problem was trying to be larger than her ability to contain it. She had approximately 60 seconds before she needed to decide what to tell Arthur and how. She used them. Arthur came through the door at 8:14 carrying his own coffee and stopped when he read her face. "What happened?" "No preamble. No good morning." "Cole Pratt was just in here," she said. "He saw the board." Arthur's stillness was different from hers. Hers came from shock absorbing itself. His came from somewhere much older. The specific quality of a man who had spent decades making fast decisions with incomplete information and had learned that stillness was the first requirement of accuracy. "Did he threaten you?" "He delivered a warning dressed as concern, told me to close the files and tell you I'd hit a wall." She paused. "He said the people behind Hastings don't do warnings, which means what he gave me was a courtesy, not a protocol." "Meaning he's not fully committed to their side. Or meaning he's committed enough to want me stopped, but not committed enough to want me hurt. There's a difference, and I don't know which it is yet." She looked at Arthur. "We have a problem that's bigger than Cole Pratt. Tell me." "He was at a Lakeward event 14 months ago, before any of this started on your end, which means he wasn't recruited after the fact. He was part of the design." She turned to the board. "But Cole Pratt has been your financial access point for 6 years. To build this structure using him as a conduit, someone had to know him. Know his habits, his access levels, his personal vulnerabilities." She looked back. "This wasn't designed from outside your organization. It was designed with knowledge of your organization's interior, detailed knowledge." Arthur set his coffee down. He was looking at the board with the expression she'd seen the first night. Not anger on the surface, but the controlled thing underneath it, denser and older. "Lena Farrow," he said. "I don't have confirmation yet, but she's the only person on my preliminary list with both the legal intelligence to design a structure this clean and the internal access to know exactly how to use Cole Pratt." She kept her voice even. "I need you to trust me on the methodology before you react to the name." "I'm not reacting." "You're very still in a specific way." He looked at her. Something shifted in the gray eyes. Not humor exactly, but the recognition of being accurately read, which was its own kind of thing. "What do you need?" "I need Cole Pratt out of this building today. A reason that doesn't signal to anyone that we know what we know. And I need Lena's communications records, not the ones she's filed with your legal archive, the raw server data. Everything she's sent and received in the last 18 months. Getting those without her knowledge means going around her." "Yes." "She manages the relationship with our IT security provider." "I know." Nora looked at him steadily. "I need you to have someone she doesn't manage get them." Arthur was quiet for a moment. Outside, the grounds crew had started somewhere. The distant sound of equipment, mundane and incongruous against everything happening in this room. "Give me 2 hours," he said. Cole Pratt was sent to oversee a supply chain audit at the Moretti Logistics facility in Gary, Indiana by 9:30 that morning. The reason given was a routine discrepancy in third-quarter freight records. Cole accepted the assignment without visible reaction, which told Nora either that he believed the cover or that he decided compliance was the safer play while he figured out his next move. She watched him leave from the upstairs hallway window, watched the car pull down the long drive and disappear through the gates. Then she went back to the workroom and kept building. By noon, she had a clearer picture of the timeline. The Lakeward structure had been assembled in stages. First the shell entities on William Jenkins' end, then the transfer protocols, then the regulatory pressure on Arthur's shipping contracts. The regulatory pressure was the piece that hadn't made complete sense until now. It had looked like a coordinated attack using Hastings' political leverage, but the timing was off for that interpretation. The regulatory review had begun before the transferred funds would have been available to Hastings, which meant the regulatory attack wasn't funded by the stolen money. It was the reason for the stolen money. Hastings had started the attack on Arthur's shipping empire using his own resources, political capital, existing relationships, the ordinary machinery of a corrupt politician with ambitions. But at some point he'd needed more liquidity, more leverage, more infrastructure than his existing resources could provide. And someone had shown him how to get it, someone who knew Arthur's organization from the inside. She wrote it on the board, not a theft, a funding mechanism. Hastings needed capital. The capital was Arthur's. The bridge was Lena. She stared at it. The shape of the thing was almost complete, and its completeness was worse than its obscurity had been, because now she could see the full ambition of it. This was not a financial crime with a political dimension. This was a political operation with a financial instrument. Hastings wasn't trying to steal from Arthur. He was trying to acquire Arthur's shipping infrastructure, the ports, the contracts, the logistics network, by destroying its value through regulatory pressure and then purchasing it at collapse price through a vehicle that would never be publicly connected to him. Arthur's empire, dismantled and sold to the man who dismantled it. And Lena Farrow, if Nora was right, had designed the key. The door opened. It was Dario. "Mr. Moretti wants you," he said. His voice carried something she hadn't heard in it before, a tightness at the edges. "Where?" "The East Study." What? Arthur was not alone in the East Study. The woman sitting across from him was in her mid-50s, silver-haired, with the compact, precise posture of someone who had spent decades in professional rooms and learned to take up exactly as much space as the situation required, and not 1 inch more. She wore a dark blazer and no jewelry except small gold earrings, and her hands were folded on the table in front of her with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting and has decided to make the waiting look like patience rather than tension. Nora had seen photographs. She recognized Lena Farrow. Arthur looked at Nora when she came through the door. His expression said, "I did not plan this." It was the first time she'd seen anything resembling apology in his face. "Lena came in this morning," he said carefully. "She has information she says is relevant to the Hastings situation." Nora looked at Lena Farrow. Lena looked back at her with an expression that was composed and direct and gave away almost nothing, almost because at the very edges of it, in the set of the mouth and the way the folded hands were fractionally too still, there was something that Nora read as the specific tension of a person who has made a decision they cannot unmake and has arrived to deliver its consequences. "Mrs. Moretti," Lena said. Her voice was a lawyer's voice, precise, calibrated, the kind that could deliver any content in the same register. "I understand you've been reviewing the internal communications records." Nora sat down. She did not answer the implied question. "I'd like to tell you something before you find it yourself," Lena said, "because how you find it matters for what comes next." "Then tell me," Nora said. Nora. Lena unfolded her hands, reached into the leather portfolio on the table beside her, and set down a single printed document. She slid it across the table. Nora looked at it without touching it first. It was a wire transfer confirmation. The originating account number was one she recognized, one of the shell entities on William Jenkins' side of the network. The receiving account was unfamiliar. She leaned forward to read the account holder. Moretti Family Legacy Trust. Arthur Moretti, sole beneficiary. The room went very quiet. "What is this?" Arthur's voice was low, dangerously low, the kind of low that had nothing to do with volume. "It's a transfer that occurred 11 months ago," Lena said. $2.2 million routed from the Jenkins Shell network into the Legacy Trust. She paused. "I found it 6 weeks ago when I was conducting a routine trust audit." "That account hasn't received external transfers in 4 years, Arthur said. "No, it shouldn't have." Lena looked at him directly. "Someone with administrative access to the trust documentation added a secondary authorization code 11 months ago. It's embedded in the account management protocol. If you're not looking for it specifically, it reads as a standard maintenance update." Nora picked up the document. She read it again, slower. Her mind was already moving, mapping the implication against everything she'd built on the whiteboard, feeling the structure shift the way a structure shifts when you find the load-bearing element you'd missed and realize the whole edifice is resting on something different than you thought. If this transfer was real and the document looked real, the formatting was correct, the routing numbers checked against her memory of the network architecture, then Arthur's account had received stolen money, his own stolen money, laundered back to him through a chain of shell entities that his own team had been investigating. If this became public, Arthur wasn't the victim of the Hastings scheme. He looked like its architect. Who had administrative access to the trust documentation? Nora asked. Lena was quiet for exactly 1 second. Historically, myself and Arthur. 11 months ago, a third access credential was added. The login trace goes to an IP address registered to a commercial VPN service. She paused. But the credential itself was cloned from mine. Cloned. My access code was duplicated. Someone with sufficient technical capacity took my credentials and created a parallel authorization that would log as originating from my account under forensic review. Lena's voice remained steady, but her hands, Nora noticed, had refolded on the table with slightly more pressure than before. If you had found this before I came to you, the evidence trail would have pointed directly at me. It still does, Nora said carefully. I'm looking at your access credential on a fraudulent authorization. Yes. And you're asking me to believe the credential was stolen. I'm asking you to look at the technical metadata on the clone. Lena reached into the portfolio again and produced a second document, a server log, dense with timestamps and alphanumeric strings. The cloning event occurred at 2:17 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was in Miami at a deposition. My hotel keycard records confirm I was in my room. My phone data confirms I didn't access any Moretti network systems that night. She set the log on top of the transfer document. Someone set me up. And they did it well enough that without this specific technical detail, you wouldn't have found the seam. Arthur was looking at the documents. He hadn't moved from his chair, but the quality of his stillness had changed. It was no longer the controlled stillness of a man managing his response to bad information. It was something older and colder, the stillness of a man recalculating the entire landscape. "Why didn't you come to me immediately?" he asked. His voice was completely flat. Lena looked at him. For the first time, the composure showed its weight, showed that maintaining it was costing her something. "Because 6 weeks ago, I didn't know who I could trust," she said, "and because I needed time to build the technical case before I brought it, or it would have looked like I was manufacturing a defense." She paused. "And because the person who cloned my credentials had to have physical proximity to my workstation at some point, which means they've been inside this building." The implication landed in the room like something dropped from height. Inside this building. Not a remote breach, not an outside actor with a long-distance technical reach. Someone who had been physically present in Lena Farrow's office, at her workstation, with enough time and access to clone her security credentials and leave no trace visible to the naked eye. Someone who was still here. Nora looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at her. Neither of them said Cole Pratt's name aloud, but it moved through the air between them anyway. "Cole left this morning," Nora said. "For Gary." "I know. We need to know if he came back." Arthur took out his phone, made a call that lasted 12 seconds. His expression during those 12 seconds did not change, but when he ended the call and set the phone down, Nora could see in the line of his jaw that the answer had not been the one he needed. "The car turned around 40 minutes outside the city," he said. "Mechanical issue, apparently. He's being driven back now." The room absorbed this. Nora looked at the 2 documents on the table. She looked at the transfer confirmation, the legacy trust account number, the $2.2 million that had been designed to turn Arthur Moretti from a victim into a perpetrator. She looked at the server log with its timestamps and its carefully constructed false trail. This wasn't a warning anymore. Cole Pratt coming back wasn't a coincidence of timing. He'd left when told to leave, and now he was returning because someone had told him to return, which meant someone knew the morning's movements well enough to direct a response within the same time frame. There was a leak still active, a channel still open. Something or someone in this house communicating outward in real time. And it wasn't Lena Farrow, sitting across the table with her hotel keycard records and her server logs, and her face showing the specific exhaustion of a woman who had spent 6 weeks carrying a truth she hadn't known how to safely set down. "We need to move," Nora said. She heard her own voice come out different than she expected. Not the careful, measured cadence she'd been using for days, but something stripped of its management layer. Direct, certain. Not just the investigation, physically. If there's active communication going out from this building and Cole is inbound, we cannot have the full case architecture sitting on an open server. The server is encrypted by a system managed by your IT security provider, Nora said. The same relationship that runs through Lena's department. She looked at Lena. "Who manages the IT security contract directly?" "I do," Lena said. "But there's a secondary administrator." "Cole Pratt," Nora said. It wasn't a question. Lena closed her eyes briefly. "Yes." Arthur stood. The movement was decisive, the body making the decision before the words did. "Dario," he said, raising his voice slightly. The door opened within seconds. Dario Cassin stood in the frame. "Get Marcus Venn. I want him in the East Wing conference room in 10 minutes, and I want Cole Pratt's vehicle met at the gate, not let through." Dario nodded once and was gone. Arthur turned to Lena. "Everything you have, the technical files, the hotel records, every piece of documentation you've been sitting on for 6 weeks, I need it all transferred to a device that has never touched this network." He looked at Nora. "Can you work from offline?" "I've been building the secondary map on paper for 2 days," she said. "Yes." Something moved in his expression that wasn't quite relief but occupied the same territory. Then Nora's phone, her personal phone, the number she'd given almost no one, buzzed once on the table. A text message from a number she didn't recognize. No name, no introduction. 4 words and an image. She looked at the words first. "He's been lying too." Then she looked at the image. It was a photograph. Dated 3 weeks ago, time-stamped at a restaurant downtown, she recognized by the signage visible through the window. 2 men at a table, the image taken from outside through the glass with a long lens, slightly grainy from the distance. One man was Cole Pratt. The other was her father, William Jenkins, who was supposed to have had no contact with anyone outside the estate since the afternoon she'd interviewed him in the windowless room. And her father was handing Cole Pratt a document. A single folded page, passed across the table with the specific, discreet motion of someone who had done this before and knew how to make the transfer look like a casual gesture. Nora stared at the photograph. Her thumb moved without fully conscious direction and zoomed in on her father's face, the face she'd known for 26 years, which had told her all her life that it was making the best decisions available to it under the circumstances. The document William Jenkins was passing to Cole Pratt was recognizable by its header formatting, even at this resolution, even through the restaurant glass. It was a copy of Nora's preliminary case file, the one she'd compiled in her first week in this house, the one she'd shared only with Arthur and with her father during the interview, as a demonstration of how far the investigation had already progressed. Her father hadn't been a passive pawn coerced into this by a man named Garrett. He had been feeding information about Nora's investigation to the people she was investigating. He had sat across from her in the windowless room with his silver hair and his diminished posture and his performance of a frightened man, and he had delivered just enough truth to redirect her attention, and then he had walked out of that room and handed her work to Cole Pratt within 3 weeks. While she was living in this house, while she was building the case, while she believed, because some part of her, the part that could not entirely stop being his daughter, had believed, that he was at minimum not actively working against her. The cold that moved through her wasn't grief. It was something that had finished being grief and become something else entirely. A hardening, a final calcification of something that had been trying to stay soft and had just run out of the structural capacity to manage it. She set the phone on the table face up so Arthur could see the photograph. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "My father has been in contact with Cole Pratt," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "He gave him a copy of my preliminary case file. which means everything I found in the first week, every thread I pulled, every name I flagged, Hastings people have known about it for weeks. Arthur looked up from the phone. They know what we have, she said. They've known almost from the beginning, which means every move we've made in the last 3 weeks has been made in full view of the people we're trying to expose. She looked at him across the table with her father's face still on the phone screen between them and Lena Farrow sitting very still in her peripheral vision and the weight of the entire collapsed structure pressing down from above. We haven't been investigating them, she said. We've been performing an investigation for them, letting them see exactly how close we were getting so they could decide when to move. Arthur held her gaze. His face was absolutely unreadable. Then we stopped performing, he said. But even as he said it, Nora heard the sound she'd been dreading without knowing she was dreading it. The distant sound of the estate's front gate mechanism, the electronic hum of iron moving on its track. Cole Pratt's car had been waved through, not stopped at the gate as Arthur had instructed, which meant Dario Cassin had not delivered the order, which meant the leak in this house was not Cole Pratt alone. And the channel communicating outward in real time was closer to this room than any of them had understood. And the person Arthur trusted most in the physical logistics of his own security had just made a decision that changed the geometry of everything. Nora looked at the door of the east study. It was still closed. For now. Arthur moved first. Not toward the door, away from it. 2 steps to the left, to the credenza against the east wall. And Nora watched his hand go to the underside of the second drawer and come back holding a phone she hadn't seen before. Burner, she realized. A phone that had never touched this network, never been registered to anything connected to the Moretti name, kept in a piece of furniture in a room that only he used. He'd prepared for this. The realization moved through her fast, that he had known, at some level below strategy and above instinct, that the house might be compromised, that he had positioned contingencies she hadn't known about, that the man she'd been sharing information with for 3 weeks had been running a parallel layer of preparation she hadn't been read into. She filed it. There was no time to feel what she thought about it. Lena. Arthur's voice was low and completely level. The East Service Corridor. You know where it goes. The garage. 3rd bay. Black Suburban, keys in the visor. Drive yourself. Don't use your phone after you leave this room. He looked at her directly. Go now. Lena Farrow stood without hesitation, the movement of a woman who had been waiting for a clear instruction and was professionally capable of executing it without requiring reassurance. She picked up her portfolio, tucked it under her arm, and moved to the interior door on the far wall that Nora had assumed was a closet. It wasn't a closet. It opened onto a narrow corridor that smelled of old stone and disuse, and Lena Farrow walked into it and pulled the door shut behind her without looking back. Arthur turned to Nora. Can you carry everything critical in your head? I've been doing that for days. The paper map on the whiteboard. I'll take photographs. 30 seconds. She was already moving. She pulled out her phone, the personal phone, the one the anonymous text had come to, and photographed the whiteboard in overlapping sections, moving methodically, no wasted frames. Her hands were steady. She didn't know how they were steady, but they were, and she used the steadiness without questioning it. 22 seconds. She erased the whiteboard with her forearm in 4 sweeping strokes, the dry erase markers smeared into illegibility. Not perfect, but it would cost someone time, and time was now the only currency that mattered. Arthur was at the interior door. There's a room in the lower level. Stone walls, no wireless signal penetrates. We go there, and we figure out what we still have. Dario, she said. I know. He let the car through. I know. His voice was still level, but it had acquired the quality of something held very tight. I've known Dario Cassin for 9 years. I know. He looked at her for 1 second. Just one. Just enough for her to see that the controlled surface had something genuine and damaged underneath it. The specific pain of a betrayal that couldn't be processed right now, and therefore had to be compressed into a shape small enough to carry while moving. Then he moved, and she followed. The lower level of the Moretti estate was older than the rest of the house. Original foundation, 19th century. Stone walls 2 feet thick that had been built for cold storage and converted at some point into a secondary utility space. The room Arthur brought them to had a single bare bulb, a metal table, 2 chairs, and the specific quality of silence that came from genuine acoustic isolation. He locked the door. An actual key in an actual lock, mechanical, nothing electronic. Nora set her phone on the table. Arthur sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, both running internal inventories, she could tell, both assessing what they still had against what they'd lost. "Walk me through what's compromised," Arthur said. "Everything on the main server. Every file I compiled in the first 2 weeks. The full network map, all the entity cross-references, the transaction trail I'd built to Lakeward." She kept her voice factual. Emotional accounting could happen later, when there was a later. "What's not compromised is what I've built since. The timeline analysis, the regulatory correlation, the proof that this is a funding mechanism rather than a straight theft. I have that in my head and on these photographs. Can you reconstruct it in a form we can use?" Given a laptop that's never been connected to this network in approximately 6 hours, yes. Arthur set the burner phone on the table. "I have 2 people I can reach through this. People completely outside the organizational structure who can get equipment and provide a secure location." He paused. "We can't stay in this house. How long do we have before Cole Pratt and whoever came in with him realizes we're not where they expect us to be?" "Minutes, maybe less." Nora looked at the photographs on her phone, looked at the whiteboard images, the overlapping maps, the connection lines, the entity names, the timeline that proved Philip Hastings had funded his attack on Arthur's shipping empire, using Arthur's own money routed through her father. She looked at it and understood with complete clarity that what she held on that phone was enough to destroy Philip Hastings if it reached the right people. It was also enough to get both her and Arthur killed tonight if the wrong people understood what she had. "My father," she said. Arthur's expression tightened. "He's still in this building. If Hastings people get to him before we do, he's been feeding them information. I know what he's been doing." Her voice came out harder than she intended. She didn't adjust it. "I also know he's the only living witness who can confirm the direct Garrett connection and the initial approach. If we lose him, we lose the human testimony that makes the financial evidence prosecutable." A silence. "He sold you," Arthur said. Not brutal about it, just precise. "Yes, I'm aware." She held his gaze. "Where is he right now?" "East Wing Guest Suite." "Can we get to him before—" A sound reached them through the stone walls. Not loud, muffled by the distance and the density of the material, but distinctive. A door impacting a frame with force. Then voices, not words, just the frequency and cadence of raised voices moving quickly. They both looked at the ceiling. Arthur stood. He moved to the corner of the room and crouched, and Nora watched him lift a section of the stone floor. Not solid stone, but a fitted panel, the seam invisible until he pressed the specific point that released the catch. Beneath it, a metal box, military green, the kind used for equipment storage. He opened it. 2 handguns, a compact radio, a sealed envelope, and a set of keys attached to a small metal tag. He looked at her across the open box. She looked back. "I need you to tell me right now if there's anything about the next hour you can't do," he said. "Ask me at the end of the hour," she said. He almost said something. Whatever it was, he chose not to say it. He picked up the radio, clicked it once to verify function, and handed her the phone and the keys. "The keys are for the tunnel access at the north end of the property. It comes out on Ashfield Road about 400 meters past the gates. There's a car parked on the shoulder, a gray Civic, 10 years old, no registration to anything connected to me. Get to it." "What about you?" "I'm going to get your father." "Arthur?" "Nora." The way he said her name, not commanding, not gentle, somewhere between the two that she didn't have a word for. "I need you to be on Ashfield Road in 10 minutes. I will meet you there. If I'm not there in 15 minutes, you drive north and you call the number programmed in the burner as Contact 1. He paused. "His name is Rourke. He knows about you. You planned for this." "I planned for everything." She looked at him, looked at the gray eyes and the hard-set face, and the man who had, over the course of 3 weeks, consistently been something other than what she'd expected him to be. and she recognized the specific difficulty of this moment, not because it was frightening, though it was, but because she was standing in a locked stone room with a man who had just handed her an escape route and kept the dangerous direction for himself. And some part of her, the part she wasn't examining right now, did not want to take the route he was pointing her toward. "Don't get shot," she said. "Working on it." She took the keys. She moved to the door. The tunnel was 4 feet wide and smelled of groundwater and decades. Nora moved through it at a pace between walking and running, fast enough to cover distance, careful enough not to trip in the low light from her phone screen. The stone walls pressed close on both sides. The darkness ahead of her swallowed the light at about 10 feet, and she moved into it anyway, counting her steps, focusing on the sound of her own breathing and the feel of the ground underfoot. She came out through an iron door behind a drainage structure on the property's north edge. Night air hit her face, cold, damp, real. She crossed 30 feet of uneven ground to the tree line and moved along it toward the road. The gray Civic was exactly where Arthur had said. Shoulder of Ashfield Road, engine cold, keys matched the trunk lock, and then the ignition. She started it, pulled the heat on, and sat with the engine running and her eyes on the rearview mirror. Behind her, through the trees, the estate was lit. Not the normal distributed lighting of a house at night. Multiple windows bright at once, movement visible as silhouettes against glass. She could see from this angle the east wing where her father's suite was. One of the bright windows was the east wing. She watched the light in that window, watched the silhouettes. 12 minutes. 13. The passenger door opened. She didn't flinch. Her body had used up its available flinch in the tunnel and had not yet restocked. She turned. Arthur got in. He was breathing hard, a shallow cut on his left cheekbone already reddening, his jacket torn at the shoulder seam. He pulled the door shut and looked forward through the windshield. "Drive," he said. She drove. "My father?" she asked. "Back seat." She checked the rear-view mirror. William Jenkins was lying across the back seat with his eyes open and his face the color of old wax, and he appeared to be uninjured but was making no movement and no sound beyond breathing. "Is he? He's in shock. He's not hurt." Arthur's voice was controlled, but the breath behind it was still ragged. He pressed 2 fingers against the cut on his cheekbone, assessed the pressure, decided it wasn't a problem for right now. "Dario was with Cole in the East Wing. They were moving your father somewhere. I don't know where, somewhere off property. I got to him first." "Did Dario?" "Dario made a choice, and it had consequences." His voice closed on the subject with a finality she understood meant he would not discuss it further. Not now, maybe not ever. She drove north on Ashfield Road with the headlights on low and the burner phone in the cup holder, and her father unconscious in the back seat and a man she'd been married to for less than a month, sitting next to her bleeding from the face, and she focused on the road, on the painted center line, on the simple mechanics of moving forward. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Rourke has a location, off-grid, outside the city. He'll be there when we arrive." "How long?" "Hour and 40 minutes. She nodded. She drove. For a while, neither of them spoke. The city gave way to suburb to the fringe landscape of outer Cook County. The big box stores and the storage facilities and the overpass lights, and then the longer stretches of dark between lights that meant they were clearing the metropolitan gravity. "They know we're out," Arthur said. It wasn't a question. "Cole will have reported it by now. If there's a direct line to Hastings," "There is." "Then Hastings knows we're mobile with whatever we've got." She kept her eyes on the road. "He has to decide whether what we have is enough to move on or whether he can still contain it." "He'll decide it needs containing." "Yes." She paused. "Which means tonight isn't the end of this. It's the part where he decides whether to run or to come at us harder." "He won't run," Arthur said. "He's too close to what he wants. He's been building this for 2 years. He won't walk away from the shipping contracts now." "Then he'll come at us harder." "Yes." She looked at the road. "We need to move first, before he recalibrates." She could feel the shape of it forming, the strategic shape, the outline of a move that used what they had against what he didn't know they still had. "The evidence on my phone. The timeline, the entity map, the regulatory correlation. He doesn't know we have the clean version. He thinks he's seen everything we built because my father fed it to Cole, but what my father saw was the first week work. He didn't see what I found after. The full mechanism, the funding structure. The proof that Hastings funded his attack using your money, that's not just a fraud charge. That's a federal conspiracy charge, and it crosses into campaign finance violations because if Lakeward funds connected to his campaign apparatus, it becomes an FEC matter. She spoke faster now, the exhaustion burning off as the structure assembled. He doesn't know I have that. He thinks I got close and then we ran. Arthur turned to look at her for the first time since getting in the car. She could feel the look without meeting it. "We don't run," he said. "We never ran." "I know. What do you need?" She thought about the gala. The detail from the original treatment, Chicago's most prestigious charity event, the room where names meant something, where a woman entering as Mrs. Arthur Moretti would register as a statement rather than a presence. She'd dismissed it as symbolic. She was reconsidering. "I need him to think he's won," she said. "I need him comfortable enough to show up somewhere public, somewhere he'd be in front of witnesses and cameras and people whose social survival depends on accurately reading a room." "The Alderman's Gala," Arthur said. 2 weeks. He'll be there. He's a featured speaker. Then that's where we end it. In 2 weeks, with Hastings knowing we're mobile and hunting us, he'll be hunting us quietly, she said. He can't go loud. Going loud means explaining why, and explaining why means acknowledging the connection to Lakeward, which he cannot do. She finally looked at Arthur. He's trapped by the same thing we are. We can't go public yet because we need the full evidentiary package in order for it to stick. He can't go public because going public destroys him. So we're both maneuvering in the dark for 2 weeks. And at the gala? At the gala, we're not in the dark anymore. Arthur looked at her for a long moment. The cut on his cheekbone had stopped producing fresh blood and had begun to dry at the edges. And in the passing highway lights, his face had a quality she hadn't seen on it before. Not softer, that wasn't the right word, but open in some way, as though the surface that was usually absolute had developed a transparency in a specific location, the specific location being whatever he was looking at right now. "You know," he said, "when I arranged this marriage, I told myself it was entirely strategic." She kept her eyes on the road. "And now?" He didn't answer immediately. In the back seat, William Jenkins made a small sound. Not words, just the sound of a man coming back to consciousness and immediately wishing he hadn't. And the moment recalibrated into something more immediate. "Now," Arthur said, "we need to get to Rourke before your father wakes up, and we have to explain to him exactly how thoroughly he's destroyed his own position." She drove. The highway opened up ahead of them, the flat dark of the Illinois countryside absorbing the headlights and giving nothing back. 2 weeks to the gala. 2 weeks to build a case that could survive a public confrontation with a congressman who had been managing his public image for 3 terms. 2 weeks with a compromised safe house behind them, Dario Cassin's betrayal still raw and unprocessed, her father in the back seat with his wax-pale face and his history of choosing himself over everything else. She thought about the whiteboard photographs on her phone, the entity names, the transaction chains, the timeline that she could now reconstruct cold, from memory, in her sleep if she had to. She thought about the structure Hastings had built, elegant in its ambition, catastrophically vulnerable in one specific place, the place where his funding connected to her evidence, the seam. She thought about standing in a room full of Chicago power in 2 weeks, not as the debt her father had traded away, not as the wife Arthur had contracted for strategic reasons, but as the woman who had mapped a federal conspiracy from a workroom in a house she'd been delivered to like a payment. She thought about what it meant to walk into that room and to have already won before anyone in it knew the game had started. Her hands on the wheel were steady. They had been steady, she realized, for a long time now, since the workroom, since the tunnel, since the moment she'd decided somewhere below the level of conscious choice that she was not going to be the thing that happened to people, not anymore, not again. Behind them, the lights of Chicago were still visible on the horizon, a dome of orange against the dark sky, the city burning with its usual indifferent energy. Philip Hastings was somewhere inside that dome right now, making calls, recalibrating, deciding what the mobile, uncontrolled presence of Arthur Moretti and his forensic accountant wife meant for the timeline of his ambitions. Nora looked at the rearview mirror, the city. Then she looked back at the road ahead. 2 weeks. She would be ready in one. And when Philip Hastings walked into that gala believing he had managed the situation, believing the threat had been contained and the evidence compromised and the woman who'd come closest to unraveling him had been scattered into the dark outside the city limits, he was going to find her already standing in the room, already dressed for the occasion, already holding the thread that would unravel everything he'd spent 2 years building. And the last thing he was going to understand before it was too late was that the most dangerous move she'd made wasn't the evidence she'd gathered, or the case she'd built, or even the husband standing beside her. The most dangerous move she'd made was surviving long enough to use all of it. Rourke's location was a former grain processing facility 40 miles outside the city, converted at some point into a working space that had the specific quality of a place built for function rather than comfort. Bare concrete floors, industrial shelving, fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency just below conscious awareness. It smelled of machine oil and old wood and the particular dryness of a building that had been heated and cooled for decades without ever being loved. Nora spent the first night at a folding table with a laptop Rourke had sourced. A machine so clean it had never touched a network, running offline, loaded with nothing but basic software, and rebuilt the entire case from memory and the whiteboard photographs. She worked until 4 in the morning. She slept 3 hours on a cot that Rourke produced from somewhere without comment. She woke and continued. Rourke himself was a compact man in his early 60s with a face like weathered sandstone and the economy of movement that came from a professional lifetime of making himself useful without making himself visible. He asked no questions about what she was building. He brought coffee when the thermos ran empty. He managed the perimeter of the facility with 2 other men whose names she was not given, and she understood from the way Arthur deferred to his operational judgment that Rourke was the kind of resource you didn't explain and didn't advertise and were deeply grateful to have when the alternatives collapsed. William Jenkins was given a room at the back of the facility. He was not restrained. He also did not leave. On the second morning, Nora went to see him. He was sitting on a folding chair in the center of the bare room with his hands on his knees and his silver hair no longer composed, loose at the temples, uncombed, the groomed performance of him finally absent in a way that should have made him look diminished, but instead made him look simply old. He looked up when she came in, and something moved in his face that she had a limited tolerance for examining. She set a chair down across from him and sat. "The photograph," she said. "You and Cole Pratt at the restaurant. Who took it?" He blinked. "I don't." "Someone was watching you. Someone sent me the photograph to warn me. I need to know who else knew about your meetings with Cole." He looked at his hands. "There was a woman. She called herself an associate of Garrett's. She said she was monitoring the arrangement to make sure it stayed on schedule." He paused. "I think she was monitoring me. I don't think she trusted me to stay useful." "What did she look like?" 40, dark hair. She had an accent I couldn't fully place, somewhere Eastern European. He glanced up. "She called me twice. The second time was 3 days before you got the photograph. She asked how the investigation was progressing. I told her it was close." "You told her I was close?" "Yes." His voice was very quiet. Nora sat with that. The woman, unidentified, possibly a Hastings operative who had her own concerns about how the scheme was being managed, possibly something else entirely, had decided that William Jenkins was a liability and had preemptively handed Nora the evidence of his betrayal. The motivations could be several: genuine conscience, self-preservation, an internal Hastings camp fracture, an operative who had decided the scheme was overextended and wanted to create distance. It didn't matter which. What mattered was the effect. The woman may have been the same person who built the credential clone on Lena Farrow's account, Nora said, thinking aloud as much as speaking to him. If there was a technical operative managing the infrastructure, she'd have the most complete picture of the risk exposure. And if Hastings didn't know about the credential clone, what does that mean? It means the scheme may have developed internal factions, people who built different parts of it and have different assessments of when it goes wrong and what they're willing to survive. Her father looked at her. In his eyes was something she recognized not as remorse, but as the specific alertness of a man who has just understood that his situation is more survivable than he thought. And that understanding was, she noticed, the thing that animated him. Not guilt, not the impulse to repair. The scent of an exit. She had known this her entire life. She had spent her entire life making excuses for it, or explaining it away, or telling herself it was complicated. It was not complicated. It was simply what he was. "You're going to cooperate fully," she said. "Every conversation with Garrett, the woman, Cole Pratt. Dates, locations, exact words where you can remember them. You're going to give it all to the investigators when this is over." "And in exchange?" She looked at him. "In exchange, Arthur doesn't exercise the options he has for what happens to you outside a legal framework. That's it. That's the deal." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. The nod of a man who is accepting terms, not expressing remorse. She had expected exactly this, and had prepared herself for it. And even having prepared, there was a weight to it, to the final confirmation that she was negotiating with her father as a compromised witness and not speaking to him as a daughter, because the version of that relationship that she'd been quietly mourning for years had in fact been over long before this week. She stood. She picked up her chair. "Nora," he said. She stopped but didn't turn. "I know there's nothing—" He stopped, started again. "I made the decision I made because I was frightened. I want you to know that. It doesn't excuse it." She considered several responses. She chose the honest one. "I know you were frightened," she said. "I was frightened too. The difference is, I didn't sell you." She walked out. The 2 weeks passed in a compressed, airless way. Time that moved too fast and too slow simultaneously, the way time moved when every hour contained work that mattered and the work never fully stopped. Nora rebuilt the case into a form that was clean, documented, cross-referenced, and prosecutable. She worked with a federal financial crimes attorney named Sauter, who Rourke produced on day 4, a spare woman in her late 40s who read Nora's compiled documentation with the focused silence of a surgeon reading an imaging report, and at the end of it looked up and said, "This is enough." For charges? For a sealed warrant and a very bad week for a sitting congressman, yes. "I need it to be more than a bad week." Sauter looked at her over the document. "Tell me what else you have." Nora told her about the woman who had sent the photograph, about the probable internal fracture in the Hastings operation, about the fact that whoever had cloned Lena Farrow's credentials had done so with a level of technical sophistication that suggested professional intelligence background rather than private sector expertise. "If there's a second actor who built the technical infrastructure and is now positioning for distance from Hastings," Sauter said slowly, "that person is a potential cooperating witness. If we can identify her before the gala—" "Then we don't just have the financial evidence," Nora said. "We have testimony from inside the design team. That changes the calculus considerably." "I know." She spent the next 4 days finding the woman with the Eastern European accent. She did it through the only available thread, the phone number that had called William Jenkins twice, which was a burner, which led nowhere directly, but which had connected to cell towers in the River North neighborhood on both call dates, which narrowed a geographic search, which combined with the permit records for the Georgetown dinner produced a list of names associated with Lakeward Strategic Partners administrative filings. And at the intersection of all of it was a woman named Vass, a former signals intelligence contractor who had moved into private financial consulting 3 years ago and whose client list, to the degree it was reconstructible, included 2 offshore investment vehicles that connected to Philip Hastings' network. Nora sent Sauter the name. Sauter made a call. On day 11, Vass accepted an immunity agreement in exchange for full technical testimony. On day 13, the federal warrant was sealed. On day 14, Nora put on the emerald dress. Arthur had arranged it. She hadn't asked him to. She'd mentioned once in passing, during one of the operational planning sessions around Rourke's folding table, that she owned one formal dress, and it was black, and she thought the occasion called for something different. She'd said it practically, not as a request. He'd heard it as one anyway, and 2 days before the gala, a garment bag had appeared in the room she was using, and inside it was a custom emerald gown, structured at the bodice, clean lines. The color so precise it looked like it had been chosen by someone who understood not just what would photograph well, but what would make the woman wearing it feel like the version of herself she was becoming, rather than the version she'd been. She stood in front of a mirror in the facility's single bathroom, industrial, fluorescent, not designed for this, and looked at herself in the dress. She looked like someone who had survived something and come out the other side with her spine intact. She looked like someone who had decided, at some point during the past month without formally announcing it, that being underestimated was no longer a strategy she was willing to employ in her own life. She looked, she thought, like the kind of woman that men like Philip Hastings had never learned to account for, because men like Philip Hastings had built their entire operational model on the assumption that women in emerald dresses at charity galas were decorative rather than dangerous. That assumption was going to cost him everything. Arthur appeared in the doorway behind her, reflected in the mirror. He was in a dark suit, no tie, the cut on his cheekbone healed to a faint line. He looked at her in the mirror for a moment without speaking. "Ready?" he said. She turned. "I've been ready for 2 weeks." The Alderman's Gala occupied the ballroom of the Meridian Hotel in the Gold Coast, and it was exactly what it always was. A beautifully maintained performance of Chicago civic life. 300 people in expensive clothes doing the careful work of being seen by one another in the right configuration. The light was warm, the flowers were pale and enormous, and the sound of the room was the specific layered murmur of conversations being conducted on at least 2 levels simultaneously. Nora and Arthur arrived at 9:12, after Hastings but before his scheduled speaking time. She had timed it precisely. She felt the room adjust when they walked in. Felt it the way you feel a temperature change. Not dramatic, not sudden, but real. Heads that turned and then turned back, then turned again. The Moretti name doing its work, but also something else, something she hadn't fully anticipated. The particular attention of a room full of people who were skilled observers recognizing that the woman in the emerald dress was not a decorative presence. She moved through it with Arthur at her shoulder, not behind her, not in front, beside her, the physical arrangement deliberate on both their parts and noticed by the room. She found Hastings at the bar. He was 55, silver-haired, the kind of handsome that was really a form of grooming elevated to an art. Every element of his appearance managed to within a millimeter of the effect he wanted. He was talking to 2 men Nora didn't recognize, and he saw her before she reached him, and she watched him see her. Watched the micro-sequence of recognition, recalibration, and the practiced reassembly of composure that took him approximately 1.5 seconds and was very good. Not good enough for her. She'd been reading financial documents that were trying to look like something they weren't for 7 years. Faces were easier. "Mrs. Moretti?" His voice was warm, the voice of a man who was excellent at warmth as a tactical instrument. "I wasn't aware you'd be joining us this evening." "Congressman." She stopped at a comfortable conversational distance, close enough to be intimate by gala standards, far enough to be uncapturable. "You look well." "As do you." His eyes moved briefly to Arthur. "Arthur, it's been a while." "Philip." Arthur's voice was completely neutral, a neutrality with texture. The 2 men flanking Hastings had gone slightly still in the way of men who are professionally alert and have detected a change in the atmosphere they haven't fully characterized yet. "I wonder if I could have a moment," Nora said to Hastings. "There's a matter I'd love your perspective on, given your background in regulatory policy." A pause. His eyes moved across her face, reading, assessing, looking for the angle. "Of course," he said. They moved to a quieter section of the room near the draped windows. The 2 men stayed where they were. Arthur stayed at a distance that was close enough to be present and far enough to be uninvolved. The positioning of a man who was letting his wife handle the room. Nora opened her clutch. Inside was a single folded document, a summary page, 2 paragraphs, the kind of thing you could read in 45 seconds and understand in 3 minutes. She held it, but didn't hand it to him yet. "I've been doing financial forensics work," she said pleasantly. "As I'm sure you're aware, the past month has been quite educational." "I imagine life in the Moretti household has its educational dimensions," he said. "Still warm, still controlled." "I've learned a great deal about Lakeward's strategic partners," she said. About the funding mechanism that connected their capitalization to my husband's construction accounts through a network of shell entities. About the regulatory strategy that was designed to depress the value of Moretti Shipping's port contracts in advance of an acquisition. She paused. About Vas. The warmth didn't disappear. That was the thing about men like Hastings. The warmth was not a veneer over something human. It was the performance itself. And performances this practice didn't crack at a single stimulus. But his right hand, holding a champagne glass, went very still. I'm not familiar with, she's cooperating, Nora said. Federal immunity agreement signed 11 days ago. Her technical testimony covers the credential clone, the server architecture, and 3 direct communications with your chief of staff regarding the acquisition timeline. She handed him the document. That's a summary. The full package is with the U.S. Attorney's Office. The warrant was sealed yesterday. He looked at the document. She watched him read it. The room continued its warm murmur around them. Somewhere behind them, a string quartet had begun playing something elegant and completely indifferent to what was happening by the draped windows. Hastings looked up. The warmth was gone now. Not replaced by anger, replaced by something that was colder and more honest. The face of a man who has run his calculations and arrived at a number he doesn't like but recognizes as accurate. You understand what you're doing, he said. Not a question. I understand exactly what I'm doing. The evidence you have is sufficient. Sauter's assessment, not mine. A federal attorney. His voice had lost its management layer. What was underneath it was not panicked. It was the specific controlled fury of a man who had been outmaneuvered by someone he'd never correctly assessed as a threat. You've been building this while you were watching what my father showed Cole Pratt? She kept her voice level. Yes, what my father showed Cole was the first week's work. It was never the full picture. She paused. I found the seam, Congressman. The place where your funding connected to the mechanism. The place your technical team built well enough to fool the first review and not well enough to fool the second. He looked at her. Really looked at her. For what she understood was the first time. Not the assessment of a man who has already categorized a woman and is now confirming the category, but the specific full attention of a man recalibrating from the ground up. What do you want? He said. I don't want anything from you. The investigators want your complete cooperation. That conversation happens Monday morning. She took the document back from his unresisting hand, folded it, returned it to her clutch. Tonight, I want you to think about the $14.3 million that you moved through my father's accounts, and the 2 years you spent building a scheme to acquire a shipping empire using its owner's own money. And I want you to think about the woman you never thought to account for. She looked at him for one more moment. She had expected this moment to feel like something enormous, like a door slamming, or a wave breaking, or some other large, dramatic physical event that matched the scale of what had led to it. Instead, it felt clean. Small, precise, and clean. Enjoy the evening, she said. It's a lovely event. She turned and walked back across the room toward Arthur. Listen. He was standing near the bar. He'd taken a glass of something he wasn't drinking. He watched her come back across the room in the emerald dress, and his face held the expression she'd first noticed in the facility. The transparency in a specific location. The particular quality of a man looking at something that continued to surprise him, no matter how many times it happened. Done? He said. Done, she said. He handed her the glass he wasn't drinking. She drank it. It was good whiskey. How did he take it? The way men like him take being caught, she said. He ran the numbers and decided cooperation was the better option. He's furious and he's frightened and he'll be managed by lawyers by Sunday night. She looked out at the room. The 300 people, the flowers, the string quartet. Cole Pratt? In federal custody as of this morning, Sauter moved on him as a secondary arrest connected to the warrant. Dario? The name cost her something to say. Not personally, but she understood what it cost Arthur, and that gave it weight by proximity. Dario made his choices, Arthur said. His voice was even. He'll have the opportunity to explain them to people with the authority to hear them. He paused. He didn't hurt anyone in this. I think that was deliberate. I don't know what to do with that yet. She nodded. Some things didn't resolve cleanly, and the honest move was to say so. My father, she said. He's been transferred to federal protective custody. He'll testify. After that, Arthur paused. After that, he has a life to figure out, without our involvement. She thought about the windowless room, the silver hair, the nod of a man accepting terms. She thought about 26 years of learning not to expect protection from the direction it should have come from. She thought about the particular exhaustion of grieving something that had never quite existed in the form you'd needed it to. Good, she said, and meant it. Not with anger, with the specific finality of a door closed by choice rather than force. Arthur looked at her. He had a way of looking at her that had developed over the past month. Not the strategic assessment of the first night, not the calculated observation of the workroom, but something that had no operational purpose and existed purely as what it was. I owe you an apology, he said. She looked at him. For which part? For the arrangement, for the way it was constructed, for using your situation rather than… He stopped. His jaw moved slightly. You deserved a different way into this than the one you got. She considered it, considered the rain on the night the car came, the lobby, the decision to walk through the doors because there was nowhere else to go, the workroom and the whiteboard and the tea that had been cold by the time she drank it, the stone room and the tunnel and the drive through the dark with her father unconscious in the back seat. I didn't get what I deserved, she said. I got what happened. And what happened made me into someone I needed to become. She looked at him. I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying it's what I have. And I'm not willing to spend what comes next being angry at the door I came through. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, Chicago did what it always did. Moved, breathed, burned with its indifferent orange light. What do you want to come next? He asked. It was the first time anyone had asked her that without an agenda attached to the answer. She thought about it honestly, about the forensic firm she'd left behind, the small office, the cases that had used her precision in service of other people's battles, about the Moretti organization's financial structure, which she now understood in greater depth than Arthur's own team, and the legitimate side of which was genuinely complex and genuinely interesting, and had multiple ongoing vulnerabilities she'd identified in passing while chasing the Hastings scheme. About the fact that she was 26 years old and had just unraveled a federal conspiracy from a folding table in a grain facility and felt, for the first time in her professional life, precisely and exactly sized for the work she'd been doing. I want to keep working, she said. The shipping contracts, when they're restored, are going to need restructured financial oversight, and the construction holding company has 3 vendor relationships that have the early markers of the same kind of manipulation your team didn't catch last time. She paused. I want a permanent office, not the workroom, my own space, and I want Lena Farrow in the room for any legal structure decisions, because she's the best legal mind I've encountered in a professional context. And whoever set her up to take the fall for this is going to be very unhappy about how thoroughly that plan failed. Arthur looked at her for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not the contained near smile she'd seen in the early days, but something fuller than that, something that had decided not to be managed. Done, he said. I also want a dog, she said. He blinked. A dog? The house is large. A dog would help with the quiet. She looked at him. Something medium-sized, not too precious. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he laughed, a real laugh, short and genuine, the laugh of a man who had not expected to be surprised by this particular turn in the conversation. It changed his face in a way she found herself storing, the way she stored things that mattered. A dog, he said. Yes. The syndicate summit happened 6 weeks later, in a private conference facility on the North Shore, the kind of room where power arranged itself without ceremony and observed itself without mirrors. Arthur arrived with Nora. The room noticed. The objection came from a man named Caruso, older, barrel-chested, Chicago-born, in an era when the rules of such rooms were assumed to be permanent. He made the objection directly and without subtlety, because men like Caruso had never needed to be subtle about which spaces they considered theirs. This room has always been for principals, he said. He looked at Nora with the particular blindness of a man who sees a category rather than a person. No disrespect to your wife, Arthur, but there are traditions. Arthur opened his mouth. Nora spoke first. Mr. Caruso. Her voice was pleasant. I understand you have 3 warehousing contracts with the Bridgeport Logistics Group currently structured through a sub-holding entity in Nevada. The entity is 12 years old and has a charter that hasn't been updated since the 2019 regulatory shift. Under the current framework, those contracts have an exposure window that could be used to challenge the operating licenses on all 3 facilities. She paused. I can close that window for you. It would take me about 4 days, or it would take your current team about 8 months if they've identified the problem yet. She looked at him steadily. I don't take up space in rooms for tradition. I take up space because I'm useful. Caruso looked at her. The room was very quiet. Then Caruso made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a concession, but occupied the territory between them, and he turned back to the table and reached for his water glass and said, to no one in particular, useful is worth something. Nora sat down. Arthur sat beside her. Under the table, without looking at her, he found her hand. His thumb moved once across her knuckles. Not a performance for the room, not a signal, just the private language of 2 people who had been through something together and come out the other side, changed in ways they were still mapping. She did not pull her hand away. Late March turned to April. The federal indictment of Philip Hastings was unsealed on a Tuesday morning, and by noon it was on every news platform in the state. The kind of story that reshapes a political landscape and leaves a silence where a name used to be. Nora read the coverage at her desk in the new office she'd been given on the 2nd floor of the estate, with its east-facing windows and its whiteboard that was currently clean, and a dog named Frank, asleep under the desk with his chin on her foot. Frank was a medium-sized mixed breed with a gray muzzle and a philosophical temperament. He had been selected at the shelter by Arthur on a Thursday afternoon, apparently by the method of standing in the corridor and waiting to see which dog decided he was worth approaching. Frank had approached. The matter had been settled. She read the coverage until she'd read enough of it. Then she closed the laptop, stood, and walked to the window. Chicago was doing what it always did. Indifferent, enormous, burning with its orange light and its cold lake wind and its perpetual reinvention of itself on top of its own bones. Somewhere in it, Philip Hastings was meeting with lawyers and doing the arithmetic of a man whose architecture had collapsed. Somewhere in it, Lena Farrow was back at her desk with a cleared name and a reorganized sense of who she could trust. Somewhere outside it, William Jenkins was constructing whatever version of himself he intended to present to the next chapter of his life. She did not think about her father with warmth. She did not think about him with hatred either. She thought about him with the specific clear-eyed understanding of a woman who had completed a forensic analysis and recorded the findings accurately. He was what he was. She was what she'd made herself. The difference between those 2 sentences was the whole story. Arthur appeared in the doorway. He'd come from whatever he'd been doing, something in the South Wing, something operational she'd get a briefing on later, the rhythms of their working life now established enough to have a shape. He looked at her at the window, and then at Frank, and then back at her. The Hastings story, he said. I read it. How does it feel? She thought about it honestly. Smaller than I expected, she said. Not bad smaller, just accurate. It's the right size for what it is. He nodded. He came to stand beside her at the window. Not touching, just beside her, looking out at the same city from the same angle. I've been thinking about what you said, he told her, at the gala. About the door you came through. What about it? I'd like to offer you a different door, he said. Not a revision of how we started, just going forward, a different kind of arrangement. One where the terms are yours as much as mine. She looked at him, at the face she'd been reading for a month, learning its language the way she learned financial documents. Not just what it said, but what it was working not to say. And what it said most clearly when it thought no one was looking. What kind of arrangement? She said. The kind where you don't work for me, he said carefully. The kind where we work together, formally. The organization, the legitimate structure, the legal exposure, and all of it, jointly managed. He paused. You know this operation better than anyone except me. Possibly better than me in some respects. In several respects. Yes. The corner of his mouth. in several respects. She looked back out the window. Frank had woken up and wandered to her feet, and was now leaning his considerable weight against her ankle in the way he'd discovered she found grounding. She thought about the woman who had stood in a lobby with a rolling suitcase and let the rain hit her face because she'd decided not to run. She thought about that woman's hands on the whiteboard, on the laptop keys, on the steering wheel in the dark outside the city. She thought about what it meant to have been through the specific fire of the past month and come out the other side, not unburned but intact. The kind of intact that was different from uninjured. The kind that meant the structure had been tested at full load and had held. Joint management, she said, equal say. On everything? On everything that matters. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the full transparent attention she'd first identified at the gala and had since learned was the thing he had the hardest time managing. The place where the performance of certainty gave way to the reality of a man who had arranged a strategic marriage and found himself inside something he hadn't fully calculated. We'd need to renegotiate the original contract terms, she said. Obviously. I want it in writing. I'd be surprised if you wanted anything else. She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked back at the window, at the city, at the April light beginning to find its way through the cloud cover in the particular tentative way of a Chicago spring. Not warm yet, not committed, but present. All right, she said. And that was the agreement. Not a declaration, not a ceremony, just 2 words in a room with a dog, and a clean whiteboard, and a city burning outside the glass. The kind of agreement that was real precisely because it required no performance, because they were both people who could read the difference between what something said and what it meant. And what it meant was this. She had come into his world as a debt, and she had stayed as a choice, and the choice was hers, made with full information, made with the specific confidence of a woman who had learned in the hardest available classroom that she was exactly as capable as the work required. She had never needed anyone to see that before she could see it herself. She had simply needed the right problem. She had found it, and now on the other side of everything the problem had cost, she stood at a window in a house that had become something complicated and real, with a husband who had learned to be surprised by her, and a dog who believed her ankles were structural supports, and a whiteboard waiting for whatever came next. Nora Jenkins Moretti looked at Chicago. Chicago did not look back. It didn't need to. She already knew exactly what it contained.